You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. I have Max Baker-Hytch. He's a lecturer and a speaker at Oxford University. We're going to talk about the rationality of belief in God. So, Max, thank you for coming.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, if you would, tell me a bit about your background and, how you came to lecture and think about this topic.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I had a very kind of loosely religious upbringing. My parents kind of took the view that they wanted me to decide for myself whether I would want to adopt Christianity for myself when I grew up, which is something I have to say that I've appreciated. By the time I was sort of 16, 17, I was pretty agnostic. And yeah, it wasn't really until I went to university to study philosophy in my first year as an undergraduate that I encountered some Christians who, I guess for the first time in my life, sort of presented to me what I took to be intellectual reasons for believing in Christianity. That wasn't something I'd really ever come across before. I just sort of assumed you kind of took it on faith or you didn't, if you see what I mean.
At that point, did you believe in the Christian faith, or were you agnostic still, or where were you at that point?
I was pretty agnostic. I would not say I was ever an atheist. That I was, I was agnostic. I didn't take myself to know one way or the other, really, whether there was a God. I looked as much as I was able at that point into some of the central historical claims of Christianity, and also kind of looked at the philosophical arguments for and against the existence of God. And I came to think that actually the case that was there seemed to be a lot more substantial than I had ever previously thought, would be the case. Yeah, so I guess that was about 15 years ago. I guess I was pretty interested in, what's known as apologetics, which is basically the idea that, you try to offer intellectual reasons for the position you hold, whether that be Christianity or naturalist atheism or really any other worldview. And so, yeah, I was
It would be funny if someone said, "Excuse me, I apologize, but did you say apologetics?" And it's a bad joke.
Yes.
It's a weird word for it. Why would they call it that, you think?
Yeah, it's a weird word, isn't it? I guess it's because the root of it's Greek, apologia, which is like to give a reasoned sort of defense of something. But you're right, it's a weird word for it. So yeah, I was especially interested in the philosophical aspect of kind of considering reasons for and against the existence of God. And so I specialized in philosophy, by which I did a master's and then I pursued a PhD and that was at Oxford. And then I had a couple of different sort of short-term academic positions. One of them was in the States at Notre Dame, which probably American listeners will be a lot more familiar with than UK. Yeah, UK listeners, University of Notre Dame. And then I've been back in Oxford for the last 6 years. And yeah, I guess my research interests have always, ever since my PhD, kind of revolved around those questions at the intersection of what philosophers call epistemology, which is that branch of philosophy that's interested in questions to do with kind of what is evidence, and how much evidence do we need to know something, can we know anything? And it's the intersection of those sorts of questions with questions to do with religious belief and God.
Okay, so what are some of the, toughest or top questions that you're still wrangling with right now?
Yeah, well, I think that the question of divine hiddenness is a really tough one. So divine hiddenness is basically the sort of fancy way of talking about the issue of why isn't there more kind of clarity when it comes to the question of God? Why especially if it's true that God exists, why would it be sort of to any extent an open question? Why would it be possible to doubt that? So yeah, I think that's certainly something that I am pretty interested in, and one that I think matters to me personally. I think matters to a lot of people.
Well, I thought about this once. If you ask God to like appear to you, it might scare the ever living what out of you, and literally mentally derange you.
Yeah.
Or change you in such a way. I guess. Yeah. It could be so shocking that it could. I wonder if it would kill you or just blast your mind away. So maybe it has to be subtle.
Yeah, and that's a number of people in the Christian tradition going back centuries, but also philosophers today would put forward a kind of argument that goes something like that. That basically it's for our own good that God has to conceal himself or be behind a veil to some extent. That we couldn't we couldn't sort of cope with it to be fully exposed to God's reality, at least at this point. Of course, Christians want to claim that one day, everyone will see clearly that there is a God. But no, it's certainly a really interesting question and a very kind of active debate in philosophy at the moment.
Well, are you, do you have faith now? Are you still agnostic, or are you a Christian, or how do you consider yourself?
Yeah, so sorry, I guess I probably didn't make that as clear as I could in the bit where you were asking me about my background. Yeah, so I converted to Christianity about 15 years ago. So yeah, no, I wouldn't consider myself an agnostic. Now, of course, that doesn't mean I don't have, questions and doubts, and I think that's pretty normal for anyone who sort of has a Christian faith but is kind of thinking through these intellectual questions. But yeah, so yeah, I would consider myself to be a Christian.
Okay, so what's the answer that you've come up with personally for yourself on this question?
Yeah, good. Well, I think it's going to be sort of two factors that feature most prominently for me. And, I'm going to want to caveat this firstly with a heavy dose of sort of epistemic humility and kind of, this is just a real stab in the dark, so that's going to be an important preliminary to anything I have to say on this issue. But yeah, so I think there'll be two factors that feature quite heavily. The first is that I think that, I think it can be encapsulated quite well by a kind of little story or parable that the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard once told. So the idea was, there's this very powerful king, and he falls in love with one of his subjects, this woman who's just a humble maiden. But he realizes that if he tries to win her over in his guise as the king of whatever country you want to set this story in, he realizes that her response will be one that may well be conditioned by fear, or it won't be a genuinely free one. It's quite likely to be coerced in some way. And so what he does is he disguises himself as a peasant, and then he goes and wins her heart. And then he can feel sure that she responded to him out of genuine love and not some kind of response of fear due to the power imbalance between them. So I think there's something that's valuable in that story that does kind of get at that if there's a God, the power differential would be enormous between us and God. And so God can't dial down sort of his status, as it were, in the way that the king can sort of pretend to be a peasant. So the only thing he can really do by way of reducing that kind of sense of coercion that could exist is to dial down the obviousness of his existence. So that's one kind of track I would take. The other, I guess, I would take is to say that I think trust. So if you think about significant relationships in your life, one of the best ways that you can show to someone that you care about them and that they're important to you is that you're willing to sort of trust them, and you're willing to kind of commit to a course of action, even though there's some risk involved. Whereby that I mean that you could end up getting hurt if you're wrong about what that person is like. Now, again, I think in the case of God, it's the type of risk that we can take isn't exactly analogous to a human case. But I think that there is a way in which a person could show that they really care about having a relationship with God, namely that they're willing to take the risk of kind of investing in a relationship with God, even though there is a possibility they can't eliminate that it may all just be in their head, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I think those would be roughly the two avenues that I would pursue, and by which I would sort of begin to sketch an answer.
Oh, okay. So what is your current role? Are you what are you doing are you just lecturing on, again, the things that you come to understand, or are you doing evangelism? Like, what is your role at Oxford then?
Right. Yes. So I actually have two separate jobs. So on the one hand, I'm on the philosophy faculty at the university, and I'm a tutor in philosophy at Wycliffe Hall, which is one of the constituent colleges of the university. By the way, so tutor doesn't really translate for the US. It's probably like associate professor, but it doesn't mean someone in the UK. It doesn't mean someone who just helps you with your homework. So yes, so I teach philosophy to undergraduates, and I do a little bit of graduate supervision. And I research and publish so as I said, in those areas of philosophy of religion and epistemology. I'm currently working on a book with Cambridge University Press in their Elements series, which is going to touch on some of these themes. But then, I also work for an organization called OCCA, the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, which is a kind of a group of people, some of whom are academics, some of whom have backgrounds in the world of business or the arts. And basically OCCA's aim is to engage in very much like these sorts of conversations about the Christian faith in various spheres, be it academia, business, the arts, media, and so on.
Okay. Well, I guess some other questions, if you don't mind. I've heard a lot of people talk about, glory to God, everything is for his glory, etc. But it makes me wonder, like, why would he need glory? Why would he care about glory? It seems like that someone with an ego would care about such things. Have you ever explored that question?
Yes. I mean, I think, that's that's one angle on it. That wouldn't be probably my preferred emphasis if I was, I think that is given as an answer to the question of why would God create, right? And it tends to be particularly people in more reformed strands of Christianity who will want to emphasize, God getting glory. And certainly I would, want to suggest that being part of the reason why God would create a world. But I also think love has to be a big part of the answer. And so I can see how one might run into the charge of sort of, it sounds like divine narcissism or something like that, if it's solely all about God's glory. I think also something to say is, Christians have, of course, always maintained that God is a Trinity. So three persons, one being. And of course, there's a whole philosophical question about how that can kind of make sense, but just sort of parking that aside for one moment. The Christian claim being that God is Trinity, then I think that also helps a bit with the narcissism worry, in that if the three members of the Trinity are each about giving glory to the other members of the Trinity, it starts to look less like a sort of single person who just loves kind of heaping glory upon themselves, if that makes sense. But I do think that, as I said, love has got to be a big part of the equation there in terms of the Christian answer to why would God create a world at all. I think it's got to be that, well, God wants to make the types of creatures, humans being one such creature, who are capable of entering into, freely chosen loving relationships.
Yeah, that is a question I've had, right? Why create everybody? Why let them go through life? Like, if I call life a gauntlet, just for example, why create this whole thing and why put everyone in it? And we've gone through thousands of generations of people, and good and bad has happened, and et cetera. Like, what's the point of doing all of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, well, as I said, I think part of it has to be to do with love and the fact that, I mean, so if, true that there is a God and God wants to create beings who can enter sort of into loving relationship with him, then I guess, going back to what we were talking about with hiddenness, it's going to have to do with the fact that creatures like us can't sort of simply be coerced or just kind of find ourselves in a loving relationship that God's kind of programmed us to be in. We kind of have to, we have to want it, and we have to sort of, I think part of that is, being in the kind of context in which our characters are being formed and tested and challenged. And it's a context in which we actually get to exercise, freedom of choice over, not in an unlimited kind of context, but we get to exercise more, what I would call morally significant free choice. So yeah, I think that's part of it. Something else I would say is, some philosophers would argue that, our origins, the way in which our species has come to be as a whole, but also, individual origins, like you and the particular lineage you have, your parents, your grandparents, and so on, are essential to you being the very individual you are. And if that's true, then basically God couldn't get you and I without having a world, like the one that has come into being. So he couldn't kind of just get heaven from the get-go, if that makes sense, if he wants you and I and everyone else in the actual world.
Well, what do you mean? So, in one hand, everyone, well, not everyone, but certain people say, oh, God can do anything, he's omnipotent. So why is there anything that would constrain what he can do?
Yeah, okay, so that's fair. So I guess omnipotence, I would say, and I think, I'm not just kind of engaging in special pleading here. Like atheist philosophers of religion as well would tend to agree with the thought that omnipotence doesn't mean being able to do anything. It means being able to do anything that's logically possible. Now, granted, there are some philosophers who thought otherwise. Descartes famously thought that God could have made 2 and 2 equals 5, could have made square circles. I'm inclined to think not. And it's not because God's not sort of powerful or strong enough to make square circles. It's just that there is no such thing that is described by the phrase square circle. There is no state of affairs there at all that even could be brought into being. So if that thought is right, that God can only do that which is logically possible, then yeah, it follows that if God wants certain things, certain types of creatures, and if it's true that those types of creatures coming into being depends on a certain type of origin, then even God can't get those types of creatures otherwise.
But, if he created the universe and all the rules in it and everything and set it, the whole thing, spinning in motion, why would he be constrained by such a thing? Because I don't know. It just doesn't make sense.
Okay, so I think you're thinking about, like, why couldn't God have made different laws of physics? So I would agree with that right. God could. So I think laws of physics are not logically necessary. So yeah, I think that's right. But then, like, again, that if it's true that the types of creatures we are creatures who have a certain origin, a certain history, then sure, God could make other types of creatures in universes with different laws of physics, but he couldn't get us. And the other thing to say is, like, for all I know, God has created these other types of creatures. There are some theistic philosophers who argue for a theistic multiverse, the idea that God would create all of the types of creatures that it would be good for God to create. And it's just that we are good enough for God to create. So I think that's what I would want to say about that.
Okay. I guess another question I have is, I wonder if, let's say there's 1 billion Muslims in the world and, X many billion Christians and Hindus, and perhaps, God says, all right, well, if you're going to believe in me in the, using the Muslim faith, and that's what you believe and it works for you, then okay, I'll accommodate you and that's what I'll be. And other people that think of him in the Christian faith way, he says, all right, I'll accommodate you and I'll be that way. Do you think it's within his, I guess it's certainly within his ability, but do you think perhaps that's what's going on? Or do you think, let's say, Christianity is the only way?
Well,
the one way that's true and the other way is not?
Okay, well, I think we need to distinguish a couple of things we could mean by saying Christianity is the only way. So one thing we could mean by that is that Christianity is true, is the true religion, and so any other religion is false insofar as it conflicts with Christianity. So that is something I'm inclined to accept. Now, it doesn't follow from that, like who ends up being saved or not, is a further question, right? I think what you're getting at is that further question. So could someone who has beliefs about God that are, partially incorrect, nonetheless end up being saved? And I guess, like, I would want to say, well, I mean, I certainly don't think that's beyond God's ability. I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles. I mean, he basically...
Somewhat.
Yeah, so he kind of toys with this question in the final installment, The Last Battle. So, basically, obviously, Aslan is kind of the true god, right, of Narnia. But, this false god is kind of set up in the last book called Tash. And there's this particular character called Emeth, who is seemingly a very good character, but he's a follower of Tash. And then when he meets Aslan in essentially kind of the Last Judgment, as it were, Aslan basically says to him, you thought you were worshipping Tash and offering your good deeds to him, but I'll accept them as if they were done to me. So, and that I think that's interesting. And certainly there are theologians in the Christian tradition who've pursued that type of avenue.
Okay, but I mean, so I guess what would be your best answer as to why, at this moment in time, there's again, just making this up, a billion Muslims that, I'm sure a lot of them are wonderful people. They believe what they believe with all their heart, but they're quote unquote wrong or misguided. Why would that happen? Why would that exist? Why would that be allowed?
Well, I think, again, this comes down to the question of like how much sort of leeway God gives us in terms of the way God governs the world. So, yeah, I mean, one scenario would be one in which God really exercises quite tight control over the sorts of influences that we can come into contact with in our lives, such that, there's kind of Christianity or atheism or I don't know what. And, basically there's like only one or two options open to anyone living on planet Earth. So clearly that's not the type of world we live in. I guess my best guess as to why the type of God described by Christianity would allow the type of world we find ourselves in is that God values a range of things about the sorts of creatures that human beings are, such as that we're deeply social, that we, the way we form our beliefs is not in any way kind of just disconnected from the fact that we're embodied. We have to live in bodies at particular times and places. We're subject to all sorts of influences. Actually, if anyone listening wants to have my fuller answer to this, I published a paper in the Philosophical Journal, which is called Religious Studies. And in that paper is called, the title's escaping me slightly, Mutual Epistemic Dependence and the Demographic Divine Hiddenness Objection. So yeah, I basically argue there that I think, that God would be likely to be interested in those sorts of goods. And of course, but a byproduct of that would be that humans will end up believing divergent things, and also that they will tend to sort of bunch up geographically in terms of their beliefs to some degree.
Okay. Do you think it's possible that God hides the outcome of what will happen in certain situations to himself? So, again, at one point people say, well, he's all knowing, he's all this, he's all that. So he knows everything that's going to happen, yet lets it happen anyway. Perhaps he does know everything that's going to happen, but maybe hides the potential outcomes from himself. I don't want to say it's part of like a game, but I guess maybe because he does it for some other purpose. I don't know. You think that's a possibility?
Okay, so is the idea that, or the scenario you're asking about, is this one in which God is omniscient about the future, but somehow he blocks that knowledge out from himself for the purpose of making decisions or something like that?
Yeah, for letting things, for the encouragement, let's say, of free will, not only, maybe it's fun or interesting to him to see what free will do, and he can intervene when he wants and not intervene when he wants. And, this kind of plays into the question of why is there so much evil and suffering in the world?
Right.
Maybe this is part of the answer. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. I think, that there is a view that is roughly like the one you describe. I mean, so some philosophers would argue that God, so let's say philosophers like Richard Swinburne or William Pascal or Peter Van Inwagen, what they would say is that God actually doesn't know the future. And it's not because sort of God's cognitive faculties are too weak or something. It's actually because there are no facts about the future to be known. So in that sense, they would claim it's not a limitation of omniscience. It's just that there is no truth of the matter to be known. So yeah, that's certainly one view. And I'm not to be honest, I don't have a very firm view on this particular question about God, how God relates to time and God's knowledge and so on. I think there is a case to be made for saying that view that I just described does kind of make the problem of evil a little bit easier. On the other hand, other Christians are worried that it sort of compromises the traditional picture of God as having perfect knowledge of the future. So yeah, I was sorry to not kind of give a sort of come down on one side of that more clearly, but yeah, I'm somewhat agnostic on that particular issue.
I mean, I guess no answers come to mind.
Well, I mean, like I said, I think I see kind of the considerations on both sides. I mean, on the one hand, the open theist view, as it's sometimes known, the one that says God doesn't know the future. I mean, you can see one sense in which that makes the problem of evil easier. On the other hand, you could argue it also sort of raises the question of, well, how does God know that there's going to be a happy ending, as it were? How could we be confident of that?
He can force it, to be any ending he wants. So he may not know what's going to come in the future, but he always can stand ready to,
Yes, that's true. Yes, I think that's right. I mean, it depends whether you're comfortable with that. Is going to depend on, again, your views on like free will and the extent to which you think God has to, or not has to, but wants to kind of respect and work with that. So yeah, on the other side, there is a view called Molinism, which you may have heard of, which tries to say that God has perfect knowledge of the future, but that's nonetheless is compatible with human free will. And the way it's compatible is that God knows what one would do in any situation in which they were placed. And these truths are not ones that God makes be true. They're sort of true. I guess they're supposed to be made true by the creatures who they concern. So that's a view that I am somewhat attracted to if I had to plump for one of the options. Then, of course, there's another option which says that actually there is no genuine free will, that God determines everything. I guess sort of like the caricature of that would be, that God is a sort of cosmic puppet master. I guess, obviously, I am caricaturing, but you can probably tell as well, I'm not such a fan of that view.
Yeah, it doesn't make much sense. Yeah. Otherwise, what's the point of anything if that's the case? If there's no free will, why have good? Why have bad? How could you even have good and bad? Then we're just actors in this like forced play. Like, what's the point?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of sum up my concerns about that view.
Yeah. Oh, another thought is, why is there evil? Perhaps, again, if there's an afterlife and God will take care of people that have suffered, then, if they suffer terribly here, at least they get redeemed later on. And it's not, horrible for them forever. So maybe that makes it more okay that bad things happen to quote unquote good people.
Well, yeah, I think that has to be part of the story. Otherwise, I don't think God's moral character can be upheld. And if that isn't the case, right? Otherwise, it does rather look like some people's, earthly life is all there is. It does seem on the face of it that some people have had earthly lives that, it would be better if they'd not come into being at all. So yeah, I do think the afterlife aspect of it is essential to the project of what's known as Theodicy, which is, roughly the the kind of effort to kind of give some sort of reasoned answer to why God would create a world with this amount of evil in it.
Questions that you've come across that just, I don't know, you just like, you can't even begin to formulate an answer to, or like which questions kind of stump you the most?
Yeah, that's well, I mean, I wouldn't say I couldn't begin to formulate an answer at all, but I mean, I do think, you know, so not just the fact that there exists evil and, you know, quite a lot of it, but there are, you know, when you look at certain particular instances of evil, the Holocaust, it is just, you know, emotionally extremely difficult to, and it can almost feel sort of inappropriate to try and start coming up with explanations for why would God allow that particular horrendous thing to be done to that person. Yeah, I think that'd certainly be something that's an ongoing kind of wrestle.
So you think that would be like one of the most impossible questions? I see.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say as well that, you know, so on the one hand, I think, you know, that there are at least sort of beginnings of good answers to the question of why would God set up a sort of overall framework in which, you know, the world could unfold in something like the way our world has done. I think it's compatible with that to say that, you know, nonetheless, just at least at the very least emotionally, when you look at particular instances of suffering, it can just be so horrifying that it can feel inappropriate to try to explain those instances of evil. And maybe there's something there as well about the thought that it wouldn't be appropriate to go to that person and start trying to give them a philosophical explanation for what they're going through. And I think I'm not the sort of philosopher who says that an explanation for why God would allow evil can only hold any water if it's the sort of explanation you could go to, you know, give to someone who's in the midst of something horrendous. But yeah, I think there's that inescapable emotional dimension, isn't there? When you kind of look in something horrendous, you know, square in the face.
Well, it's easier to say and pontificate on it versus, you know, you being or me being in a horrible situation where, you know, we're being like tortured to death or something, or something horrible is happening. Then it would be, I would think, incredibly hard to, you know, to sit there and be like, well, maybe it's because of this or that. Because you'd be in the thick of it, so upset, you know?
Yeah, I think that's right. And the other thing that I haven't brought up yet is that, you know, and I'm not claiming this as an explanation for why there would be evil in the first place, but I also do think that this is, you know, it puts things in a different light. If it were true that, you know, this claim that God actually became a human being temporarily and, you know, experienced human hardship and suffering firsthand, I do think that puts a different light on things. I mean, one kind of analogy that I might sort of offer to get at why I think it puts things in a different light is like, suppose that so I have two kids, two girls, and suppose that I have to take one of them to have some kind of medical procedure that they're really terrified about. And I can't explain to them why it has to be done because they're too young. But suppose it's just like having some blood taken. And, you know, I can't explain why it needs to be done. But suppose that like I have the same procedure done on myself at the same time so that she can see that I'm kind of going through what she's going through. So that communicates something of kind of solidarity to her that it doesn't exactly substitute for an explanation, but I think it does bring something important to the picture.
Makes sense. Okay. I don't know what any other questions that in particular you wrestle with that are, you know, that's part of your main philosophical thoughts and you spend a lot of time on considering.
Well, I mean, I basically think I could encapsulate the sort of main philosophical objections against theism or Christian theism under 4 headings, all of which begin with an H conveniently. So, and we've talked about most of these already. So horrors, in other words, the problem of evil; hiddenness, why God isn't more obvious. The other 2 we haven't touched on much. So human origins, you know, why is it that we seem to have come about from this slightly kind of messy, very long process of evolution? In the final one, which we haven't talked about at all, hypocrisy? Why is it that, many people kind of claiming to be Christians sort of seemingly don't manifest the kind of character transformation that one might think ought to? I would say that basically, at least the kind of things that strike me as kind of the major intellectual questions for Christianity can be summarized under those four headings.
Okay. Like, I guess it's getting personal, but do you get any promptings from God? Do you feel like you're able to converse with him in any way? Some people say they'll get promptings from the Holy Spirit. Does that happen to you?
Yeah, I think, I'm probably how much this comes across, but like I'm not necessarily the kind of person to whom that happens very often. I guess the main way in which I sort of experience God, as it were, is in terms of like the way in which I feel like God makes sense of things intellectually. I think, so to be honest, in terms of what you might call religious experiences, the type of thing that I have found most compelling over the years is what I might call the conviction of sin. Sorry to use a very kind of Christian-y jargon sounding term, but yeah, I think I have found that to be much more kind of compelling in terms of my experience of God than say so I'm not someone who has a lot of what I would describe as really tangible experiences of God in a kind of charismatic worship setting. Which is not to say I've never had anything of that sort, but I think that sense of kind of really convicted that, gosh, something I said to that person earlier, that day, that would have really cut them to the heart. That was a really hurtful thing to say, that kind of thing. And I would say as well that I experience a big difference between before I was a Christian and after, in terms of the extent to which, I experienced those kinds of things being kind of brought to my consciousness.
I don't know if it's up to you, but can you share the story of like how you came to faith in the first place?
As I said, I was sort of pretty agnostic by late teens. So I turned up at Exeter University for my undergraduate to study philosophy and politics. And honestly didn't have a great deal of interest in those subjects. I was more there just to kind of have a good time. And I think, it was really a case of two things primarily, which got me to take Christianity seriously for the first time in many years. So one was encountering a number of Christians in my halls of residence, or I guess dorms would maybe be the American term, and I think I experienced a difference in the quality of the friendship and the community. And it seemed the friendships were deeper and more genuine somehow than the friendships I'd had that were, I guess, I felt a little bit more sort of superficial and based on kind of how much you could drink and that kind of thing. So that was significant, I guess, in getting me to think, okay, there's something that, is going on with these people that is worth looking into. And then the other thing was, as I said earlier, kind of encountering really for the first time an intellectual case for Christianity. It hadn't really previously occurred to me that there would be sort of reasons, intellectual reasons for, thinking that Jesus existed and said and did various things, and that God existed. And so I think, it was those two tracks together. It would be hard to kind of pin it to one particular moment or one particular thing. But yeah, and I would say that kind of happened over a period of maybe 6 months.
Oh, was there a moment when your consciousness shifted, or is it just a slow accretion of belief?
Yeah, I think it would be hard to sort of pinpoint it to one thing. It was incremental, right? I mean, C.S. Lewis kind of supposedly had a conversion that was multi-stage, right? He went from first being an atheist naturalist to being an idealist to then being a theist and finally being a Christian. So, I think that kind of multi-stage conversion is actually quite common. And I suppose, I would say I went through different stages. I didn't start out as a kind of thoroughgoing naturalist or anything like that, but the first step really was to becoming some kind of theist and taking more seriously the idea that there might be a personal God. I think I'd always been open to there being some kind of life force or something, but I think it was the first step really was becoming more open to there being a personal being at the foundations of reality. And then, I looked into the more specific historical claims to do with Jesus and so on, and became convinced that there was, a significant historical case for key events around Jesus' life, not least sort of his death and his followers claimed his resurrection after that. So I think it was sort of incremental and there were various stages to it.
Okay. And I guess last question, I don't know if this is the right word for it, but it seems like a lot of things in life are, I don't know if the word is paradoxical, but you're not likely to get in shape eating bad food, even though eating ice cream, let's say, is fun. It's sitting on the couch. You got to put in hard work. And it just seems like good comes from bad. Sometimes bad people seem to serve good purposes. It just seems like the world is full of paradoxes, and I would guess that that's, part of God's nature. But why do you think that is? Or do you agree that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think a genuine paradox is one where, there's like two things that we want to affirm that seem to us to be contradictory, and we can't see how to reconcile the contradiction, but we seem to have good reason to affirm both things. So, I mean, I think the examples you gave were things I wouldn't necessarily categorize them as paradox in that sense that I just gave, but I think, but clearly I recognize what you're getting at. I mean, I think,
what would you call it?
Well, I mean, I guess, in terms of like good coming out of bad, I what would I call that? I mean, people in the problem of evil literature would sometimes call that like higher order goods, would talk about. So a first order good would be a good that you can have just all on its own, like the pleasure of eating ice cream, let's say. But the good of kind of reconciling with like a former enemy, right? That's I mean, I don't know if you would recognize that as a good, but I think I take that to be a significant kind of good. And it's one that you can't have unless there's been some sort of falling out or enmity that needs to be overcome, which is a bad thing in itself. So I guess, why is goodness and evil structured and related to each other like that? I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for you.
It seems to pervade every question also that you ask and I ask, Yes. Why doesn't God reveal himself by saying boo? There seems to be I guess maybe we can call it a trade-off there. Why does good sometimes come from evil? Why does hardship produce benefit? It's weird that things seem to be geared that way so often.
Trade-off is a good word to use. I think that's right, and I think you're right to point out that seems to be a concept that's central to these discussions about why would God not make himself more obvious? Why would he allow the sorts of evils that we find in this world? I think it's to do with the fact that, I mean, fundamentally, I think it's to do with the fact that the kinds of really interesting, complex, what I would see as highly valuable goods, that they just are the kinds of things that you can't have just all in isolation. They seem to have to come about through a narrative process which involves the overcoming of evils or the triumph over adversity. I think that's just a kind of logical truth. I'm not sure. Sorry, it's not very satisfying to say this, but I don't know that there's a great deal more that can be said about that. Any more than can be said about why is it that an equilateral triangle has equal internal angles. It's just kind of a conceptual truth or a truth of logic, I think, that certain kinds of goods just logically are dependent on certain types of evils in order to be able to come into existence.
Mm. Yeah, well, I don't know why either. That's why I'm asking you all the easy questions. I'm just kidding. So for we're just about out of time. For listeners that want to learn more from you and get your upcoming book, where can they go to find out more?
Yeah, sure. Well, the easiest way is to go to academia.edu and just Google my name, Max Baker-Hytch. Or equally, actually just Google my name, Max Baker-Hytch, and you'll see my university faculty profile, my academia.edu page, and that has free to access versions of various of my published papers. So yeah, that would be the place to go.
Okay. Well, very good. Max, thanks so much for taking the time to do this podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.